How strong would a Quirkless Deku be? Ever since My Hero Academia's beginning, there's been a sizable chunk of people that have said the series might have been more interesting if Deku were Quirkless. Personally, I don't think it's a great idea, but that's not the point of this video. The entire notion of Deku being a Quirkless hero had me wondering, how strong would he be if he were Quirkless? Could he actually make it as a hero without a quirk, just from his smarts and raw strength alone? On the surface, it seems like that's not possible. It almost sounds ridiculous because the series outlines right at the beginning that not all people are born equal, with Deku being framed as much weaker than everyone else. But you know what's ridiculous? How strong Deku is without One For All. I never had the idea to make this video until I made my Hunter exam video. It isn't out yet, but in it, I put MCs from their first arc up against the Hunter exam. I never scaled much with My Hero Academia beforehand, at least not the early parts of it. But for that video I went in assuming Deku was just weak, and on the surface he seemingly is just an average kid in terms of power. But the more I looked into this, the more I realized Deku actually has a lot of feats to go off of, and he's scary powerful compared to normal people. For a lot of this we use feats up until the sports festival, because there's a couple different things to note from this point in the series. For one, obviously Deku didn't get his quirk right away. He had to do training beforehand, so he has some feats from that. But also, after he got his quirk, there were points when he wasn't using it because he couldn't control it. And there's also an important statement here too from Deku, where he says he only got a small boost in power from One For All. Not only was he not using his power a lot, but even when he did use it, he was only using it at 5%, and he couldn't even use it properly. Pretty much everything he does here up until the sports festival is just him. He used his power so sparingly because whenever he used it, it just broke his body. So we know for a fact that a lot of these times when he's fighting or doing something else, he's not using his quirk because he's fine. And also it's pretty overt when he's using his power from One For All. It is signified by the energy going around him. So a lot of what he's doing at this point is his actual strength. And this is objectively the case before he got his quirk too. Also remember, before Deku got his quirk, he had to train for a few months, and he overworked his body in the process. He hadn't trained for long, and based on All Might's plan, he wasn't training properly either, and he was still this strong. Take all that context I just gave you and keep that in mind throughout this video. What I'm trying to say here is this might just be scratching the surface. Let's start with lifting strength because there's a couple of feats for these that are really easily provable too. First off, his One For All training. In his training, he carries All Might on his back while walking. He's clearly struggling with it, but this is still worth noting. So first off, this is on a beach, on the sand. Have you ever walked in sand? Have you ever worked out on sand? Not to mention, we have an exact weight for All Might too, so this is really easy to calculate. He's around 560 pounds. Deku is carrying 560 pounds on his shoulders through sand. Not dragging it, not holding it, but balancing it on his shoulders. And walking on sand, making the whole process even tougher. There's been way higher records of this in real life, but those are by strongmen. People who have basically trained their entire life for this. For example, the biggest record I could find for this is Paul Anderson, who lifted 6,270 pounds. But this guy's a 360-pound strongman who is made for this, and he's holding it in place. This was a backlift where the human body is able to support more weight. Although this record isn't properly verified, so if we want to use a verified record, we could use a lift by Greg Ernst in 1993, which is 5,340 pounds. This isn't to devalue his record because it's still really impressive, but you can't compare the weight of a backlift to carrying something across a certain distance, especially with how short these backlifts are. So as a comparison, we need something more in line with what Deku did. One comparable feat I found is from another strongman, Hafthor Bjornsson. As you'd expect with a professional strongman, this guy's a beast. In a Norwegian competition, he carried 650 kilograms for 5 steps. It was a 33-foot-long log that he was carrying. In the Imperial system, that's 1,430 pounds. Over 2.5 times the amount of weight Deku was carrying. We don't know what distance Deku carried All Might. But again, this is someone who's actually built for this. This guy's 6'9" and 230 pounds. And as for Paul Anderson, he's 5'10", 360 pounds. Deku is 5'5" and 143 pounds. And he's clearly a lot leaner. Obviously, being a bigger person means you can lift easier. So of course Deku's feats are going to be lower than that. But I also found something in my research that was pretty interesting, so I was trying to quantify how much harder sand would make it, and I couldn't find something exactly for this situation of carrying something heavy across a beach like that. Plus, we don't know how the sand is on this beach. Maybe it's hard, maybe it's very soft, but we'll assume it's just normal beach sand. One study I found shows that you exert 1.6 times the amount of energy as you normally do when you're working out on sand, but this more so applies for cardio from what I saw. On top of expending more energy, sand is obviously unstable, so your leg muscles have to work way harder by default. I can imagine this would be compounded too when you're carrying something nearly 4 times your body weight. So it's a bit tough to calculate this feat, and have something comparable to it because, first of all, we don't know what the sand is like that Deku's walking on. Second, we don't know the amount of distance he carried All Might across, nor the amount of time. But I think by at least giving that comparison, specifically from Bjornsson's lift, it really goes to show how impressive Deku's feat is. He's nearly 100 pounds lighter than this guy. Plus, he's working on sand, which is naturally harder to work on. So I guess the best thing I could do is compare a ratio of what he's lifting to his body weight. Bjornsson carried 6.2 times his body weight. Deku is carrying 3.9 times his body weight. We can't get an accurate estimation of how much effect the sand had on him, but let's use that 1.6 times figure from before. because it is stressing his body 1.6 times more than usual. So multiplying that 3.9 figure by 1.6, rounded up we get about 6.3 times. Again, we can't say for certain how correct that calculation is, especially because we don't know the distance that he carried it, how stable the sand was, how much more it stressed his body than normal, anything like that. But with that estimation, that would mean by comparing the ratios of these lifts, Deku's would be more impressive. And again, he was overworking himself during this training. He had no experience with it before, he was thrown into it pretty quickly, and he was overworking himself so it wasn't as effective as normal. Considering Deku's build and the fact that he's 14 here, this lifting feat is absurd. But it gets even more absurd. In the sports festival, we see him lift up this plate of steel from this robot, so naturally I went to look and see how much this weighs, and thankfully someone already did the hard work for me, and based on this page, it seems like an accurate calculation. Thanks to the Rusty One on Versus Battle Wiki for this, I'm going to show their calculations here. You know how much this metal plate weighs? Nearly 870 kilograms. For you Americans like me, that's over 1,900 fucking pounds. And he doesn't lift it, he's running with it, and he's swinging that shit around and digging with it. He swings it so easily he uses it as a weapon against a robot. So let's also look at him use it as a weapon, because this counts as a good lifting feat too. Once more, it seems someone did a calculation for this too, so I checked this one and it also seems accurate too. Thank you therefore on Versus Battle Wiki for this calculation, I'm going to use this one here too. So if we look at Deku swinging this metal plate, he swings it at, drumroll please, 100 miles an hour. He's swinging 2 tons at 100 miles an hour. For reference, this is faster than professional MLB players swing their regular baseball bats. He is swinging 2 tons of metal faster than Babe Ruth swung his baseball bat, which was at 75 miles an hour. Average MLB swings nowadays are about 80 miles an hour.
What's even crazier, this equates to like 85 tons of force. For reference, with that much force, he has the power to lift an M1 Abrams tank, with a Hummer EV stacked on top of that, with room to spare. That wouldn't even be close to his limit. Just a reference for how stupid that amount of force is.
Dude, is this not fucking insane? And remember, he's not using 5% here. It would have been signified by the energy around him. And he flat out stated it only gave him a small boost in power, so maybe it accounts for some of this. But like, it's not gonna make him this strong. If it's a small boost, it's not gonna do this to him. And that feat of him lifting All Might through the sand was before he got One for All. This is just his lifting strength. This is absurd. None of this has to do with his quirk. He doesn't even use One for All here, and as we established, he's strong to begin with and only got that minute boost. By the way, I have no problem with this. I like Deku. I am more than happy to gas up his power. I'm just expressing my amazement because what the hell? People have dragged more weight IRL too, but this is different. You ever seen those strongman videos where they pull a plane? Pulling a plane behind you is insanely impressive, don't get me wrong. But again, just like when I compared it to that deadlift before, there are other factors involved in that too. When pulling something, you also have to account for friction because friction can make it easier to pull something, assuming there's less friction than normal. Or in the instance of the plane, for example, it comes down to a rolling coefficient because there are wheels on it. And there's a difference between moving something with wheels horizontally by pulling it than actually lifting something and carrying it through sand. Again, these feats are impressive, but it's also kind of misleading because this doesn't mean someone could just lift that whole plane. Think of your own life. If you've ever had to move heavy furniture or even a car, for example, because that happens often, people have to push cars when they break down. When you push or pull that furniture or push a car, for example, it feels way less heavy than it actually is. Sure, it feels way easier, but just because you could push a car doesn't mean you could deadlift it. Oh, and by the way, when we're talking about pushing cars, Deku has actually moved a truck before too, and he didn't push it. He moved it uphill, on a pile of trash, on a beach. Granted, it was a small truck, but look at this. He would have had to carry it through a pile of trash, which is unstable to begin with, which is also on sand, which is also unstable. Somehow he managed to lift this fucking truck on the top of this hill. He can't push it up there. This isn't a straight road on a hill. He's on an unstable surface on top of an unstable surface, lifting something and climbing at the same time, working even more against gravity. Just for reference, I looked it up and these are apparently called K-trucks. They're tiny trucks that are common in Japan. They are about 1,500 pounds. We don't know how long it took him to do this, but still, this is insane. We spent a lot of time covering lifting, but now let's look at attack power. For this, it's a little more convoluted because with the lifting stuff, at least we could actually calculate how much he's lifting and compare it to IRL feats. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps the channel and provides really good feedback for me. Here, we have to kind of assume some things, and it relies way more on traditional power scaling. Also, there's much less feats to work off for this, but thankfully, for a lot of it we could look at Bakugo versus Deku, both fights actually. A lot of Bakugo scaling could help us get a gauge of Deku's power at this point. This is the earliest point possible for something like this too, which helps it be closer to his true quirkless self, at least in regards to the first Bakugo versus Deku fight. It is also stated in Chapter 9 that he's fighting without his quirk here, in case that wasn't apparent enough. Quantifying the power of Bakugo's regular attacks is a little tougher, because we mostly see him use these explosions. However, in the second fight with Deku, he actually uses regular physical attacks a lot too. The issue with that though is we don't know how much Bakugo's physical power has grown since he first started at UA. When we first see him fighting, he's mostly just using his explosions. But by the point of their second fight, his physical attacks are enough to actually hurt and keep up with 5% Deku, matching him in battle. Not to mention also him taking those attacks, which will come into play later on when we cover durability. At this point, Deku's 5% attacks are actually quantifiable. He has multiple feats with that, and at lowest, his 5% strike should be around large building level, but you could actually scale it way higher up to city block level and beyond. I also found another interesting calculation, also from the Rusty one. Thank you again for this. This one actually has to do with two heroes, one of the movies. There's a steel structure he destroys with a kick, using 5% of his power. To do this, he'd need the power of around 712 tons of TNT. So if we use this feat, 5% Deku's attacks can be scaled to around multi-city block level. But let's be more conservative and say we need to account for Bakugo's power increase ever since he started training at UA, since the second fight takes place way after the first fight and they have trained a lot since then. So let's use large building level to be conservative. So at worst, accounting for the fact that the second fight takes place later on, we could say an adjusted Bakugo has the durability of around large building level, and is also dishing out attacks at that same level of power too. And when we apply that here in this first battle, that means Deku is taking large building level attacks, and also at one point he even knocks the wind out of Bakugo with one of his own attacks. Deku is dishing out those blows as well. Again, we have to stress that those are partially assumptions, because we're accounting for the fact that Bakugo's power likely increased between here and his second fight. The thing is, we don't know how much, and maybe Bakugo is at the same strength, we don't know for sure. He has mentioned before that Deku's growing at a rapid pace in comparison to him, so maybe he didn't grow all that much. But I think that conservative estimate is a good lowball here, giving Deku large building level attacks, and also this would apply to his durability as well. Scaling the durability here is also a little tough to say, but this should apply to that too. Not to mention, he took the full force of one of Bakugo's powerful explosions at point blank in Chapter 10. Granted, with this one, he activated the last second to launch a counterattack of his own, which destroyed the building, but it was only with one arm, and Bakugo's explosion wasn't 100% concentrated just on his arm. Deku clearly had other signs of damage around his body too from this. So while his arm did guard a good amount of the damage, this should count for something as well since it wasn't purely concentrated on that arm. But also, earlier in the battle, he does take other smaller explosions from a close distance. And what I said before about Bakugo's durability being pretty high around here, as well as his regular strikes being pretty high too, that would apply to Deku here. And it's not like Bakugo was holding back either. You could at least tell that he's being really serious here. So again, just like his attack power, that means Deku's durability is also pretty high too. Around that same level, and that's being relatively conservative. Now on to speed. This one's interesting because, for one, during the sports festival he was able to react to Todoroki's ice, which had been shown to move at supersonic speeds, around Mach 2 by this point. And remember, still in the sports festival, he does use One For All, but he doesn't use it all the time. And he also doesn't use it in his legs, so any combat movements he makes here are just his base speed. Since he uses One For All so sparingly, and it's pretty clear when he does and doesn't use it, the speed showcased here isn't really attributed to One For All. His reactions are actually just that fast too. If we really want to highball Deku's reaction speeds, we can look at his fight with Bakugo. So let's go back to that comparison I made with Bakugo versus 5% Deku. Around that point in the series, 5% Deku is able of dodging rifle fire from two people a few meters away. Bakugo during their second fight is able to keep up with that. Unlike the power of his physical strikes, we know for a fact that Bakugo's explosions have improved by then. So in this first battle, it's definitely weaker. There's a point in this battle when Bakugo uses his explosions to move, something that he frequently does. Deku even comments that it's so fast he can't actually dodge, but he plans to counterattack. We clearly see him react to it, and he seems confident enough to counter it. In the end, he was actually feinted and outplayed by Bakugo. But still, Deku did react to it. He just admits that he can't dodge it. If he did dodge here, I'd be able to calculate this much easier, but I'm actually not sure how to do that for a counterattack, especially because it's an attempted counterattack that didn't go through. But at the very least, this is a good way to judge his reaction speed at this point. So if we go back to Bakugo versus Deku round 2, and we remember that 5% Deku here is hypersonic, which means Bakugo should also be hypersonic, let's retroactively apply this to their first fight too. So based on Deku dodging bullets, this is a fictional gun so we can't really tell what it's exactly supposed to be, but to me it looks like an FN Scar 17S, which at least gives us a decent idea of what the muzzle velocity might be. Based on the distance Deku's dodging from and how quickly he dodges, also accounting for the fact that this could be a different gun, I calculated that he could be moving anywhere from 2,000 meters a second to 2,500 meters a second at the high ball. At low ball, that's Mach 5.8, and at high ball, that's Mach 7.3, which would make Deku hypersonic either way. And in the fight against Stain, 5% Deku is around as fast as Ida, using Recipro Extend. This is consistent with the bullet feed, because Ida also moves at hypersonic speeds with this. Deku might even be moving quicker than Ida here. Again, another good feat. So then back to Bakugo, let's account for the fact that he's a little weaker here, and let's be liberal with the reduction in power. We'll say his explosions are half as strong at this point. Again, this is an assumption, we don't know for sure, but that would mean Deku's reaction speed here is around Mach 2.9, up to Mach 3.7. We'll use him combating Todoroki's ice as a measure for his combat speed, around Mach 2, and say that his reaction speed's a little quicker, giving him reaction speeds over Mach 3, which sounds pretty consistent. Supersonic combat speed, and supersonic plus reaction speed. Take that reaction speed with a grain of salt though, because we don't know how much Bakugo's explosive power has increased since then. Remember, I only halved it from where it was in the second fight between him and Deku. It could have had a small increase, it could have had a big increase, we don't know. But I think I'm being pretty fair and relatively conservative with how I'm scaling that too. And at best, if we're using Bakugo's explosive power here as he was in his second fight, which could definitely be true because he's just using it for movement and not attacks, that would mean at very absolute highball, Deku would have hypersonic reaction speeds at this point, up to that Mach 7.2 figure I gave before. And now something more low-key, Deku's intelligence. This is something that's not quantifiable, it's just something that's an objective fact, which makes it a lot easier. I know the whole speed thing was a little more convoluted, but this one's easier to go through. One thing that really shouldn't be overlooked in scaling is the fact that Deku is insanely combat smart, especially when he's up against someone who he's studied before, like Bakugo. His intelligence can help bridge the gap in some fights. In his first fight with Bakugo, we see this, and even All Might points out this exact thing. Deku is incredibly strategic, and he has great predictions in the battle, on top of those great reaction speeds we covered before. He's smart and, more importantly, incredibly adaptable in fights. So where does that leave us? This all might seem incredibly unreasonable, and I get that. At least for the lifting stuff, I don't think that's arguable because we have defined feats for that. But also remember, with attack power, durability, and speed, I was being more conservative with it. It sounds crazy on the surface, but on screen I'm going to throw a timestamp. If you don't want any spoilers for the series, then skip to this point. Alright, ready? The proof we have is Mirio. This is a blatant example of someone losing their quirk and still retaining a bunch of power. And Horikoshi has flat out said before too that Mirio is the strongest student without quirks. Of course, when using his quirk, he does have more attack power, but that's when he's actually permeating through stuff. His permeation quirk doesn't just boost his base as is. His attacks get stronger by utilizing the momentum he gains from permeation. If he fights without it and just punches it normally, none of that power is attributed to his quirk. And obviously he's still growing stronger after losing it. Plus, his reaction and combat speeds remain really high too. Yes, his quirk helps him here, but there's points when he doesn't use his quirk, and obviously the point when he's quirkless. The whole reason I'm bringing him up in the first place is to prove that quirkless people can be that strong. Obviously, quirkless Deku doesn't scale to quirkless Mirio, but Mirio sets a precedent that people can be that strong when quirkless. Okay, now we're away from the spoiler stuff, so I won't mention any of that anymore. So yeah, by the standards of the universe, Deku's definitely not the strongest person, not even close. But by actual human standards, he's ridiculous. And everything I went over is consistent and also reaffirmed by that other spoiler thing I mentioned. Quirkless Deku, at the age of 15, before fully delving into hero training and actual experience, he's performing feats beyond any human in history. It seems regular people in My Hero Academia are just that strong for some reason. So on the surface, it sounds ridiculous to say Deku's that powerful, but it clearly seems like he is. And remember, we were still really conservative here with his power, and we don't know his full potential. So just keep in mind this could be a lot higher if he was an actual quirkless hero. He might not be the best in the verse, but he could adapt. And by real life standards, he's a monster. Let me know what you thought below. Was there anything I should add, something that I shouldn't have counted? Anything. And like usual, I know it's a power scaling video, so be civil in the comments with each other. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.